Now, why would a director hide an A-list movie star under a papier-mâché head? To understand, you really have to see Michael Fassbender's top-heavy performance in the new film from Lenny Abrahamson, Frank. This engaging, subtle and often moving film explores the dark side of creativity and the daft side of wearing a big plastic head, even in the shower. It's inspired by the youthful exploits of writer Jon Ronson in the late 80s as the keyboard player for the Frank Sidebottom Oh Blimey Big Band. Under the head of that Frank was musician Chris Seavey, a devoted son of the North who achieved a cult following by belting out reliably dreadful cover versions of pop hits. Here we get an insight inside the head.
How to describe Frank? Mostly, he seems friendly, though sometimes a little intense. He can hide himself away for days at a time. What goes on inside that head?
Jackpot. What have we got here? Lay an egg for me, little ginger bird. Lay an egg.
Frank says he must push us to our furthest corners and unlock the great music that hides there.
Squat.
Abramson's film, you may have guessed by now, is not the story of Chris Seavey, who died of throat cancer 4 years ago. It borrows the fake head and the lead character of keyboard player John, played by Donald Gleeson, and then strides off unashamedly into the realm of fiction. Frank is really called Frank, a charismatic but deeply unstable frontman for the unpronounceable Soronfrubs, a band of sociopathic misfits whose musical talents are more than matched by their hang-ups. Seeking conventional glory, the fictional John persuades them to play the South by Southwest Festival in Texas, a recipe for disaster. I asked Jon Ronson why he'd chosen not to write a standard pop biopic.
Well, there's a few reasons. Firstly, Chris didn't want it to be a biopic. He died probably 2 years into us writing the screenplay, and it wasn't even a stipulation, his only kind of request was that there wasn't a Chris Seavey character in the film, because I think he felt that any reality of Chris would damage the kind of myth of Frank. So that really left us with two choices. Either you make a film about Frank Sidebottom, a la kind of, like sort of Pee-wee's Big Adventure, where Frank Sidebottom goes on an adventure, or you do something completely different, where you take the kind of essence of Frank and of the story of somebody like me being plucked from the suburbs to join this crazy avant-garde band, and then just take it off in any kind of fictional direction that you want. And of all the choices, that one just seemed the most kind of exciting, I suppose.
What do you think The Mask represents? I'm sure this is a very multi-layered question, but it seems to represent lots of different things, some of them tragic, some of them comic.
Yeah. I'm slightly worried about over-psychoanalyzing
yes.
him, but I will for a moment, even though it may not be true, it may not be right. But in real life, Chris was quite chaotic and Frank was really innocent. So Chris was prone to overhedonism and Frank was like a child. And I wonder, I know other people around Chris would say this is nonsense, but I wonder whether it was like Frank was a nicer place to be than Chris, when you're sort of safe inside the head.
In the film, it's almost a mediating mechanism between Michael Fassbender playing Frank and reality. It's as though he can't cope with reality without that prism.
Yeah, and just, I think, kind of the safety of being inside a head. I mean, certainly for the film, for the purposes of the film, I really loved the idea that he would wear this head with this facial expression that would never change, because as the film progresses, our Frank goes through a lot of emotional changes, yet his face never changes. And I thought, A, that was like really interesting. B, it would be a really good challenge for an actor to have to do all of that just with their voice and with their body movements, which I think, by the way, Michael Fassbender does incredibly well.
Did he research the life of the original Chris, Frank, or did he do other forms of preparation for the part that were, as you say, enabled him to express, as he does so vividly, his feelings through his body, not through his face?
I believe that he didn't research the life of the real Frank. I think he felt that, because our screenplay by then was completely fictionalised. So by the time he got the script, it wasn't about Frank Sidebottom anymore. It was this kind of amalgamation of Frank and Daniel Johnston and Captain Beefheart. So I think he felt he didn't need to explore Frank for that reason.
If there's been a binding theme in all of your journalism and documentaries, I suppose one of them is a fascination with the marginal. And
an increasing respect for the marginal.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things in the film that's very striking is the notion of exploring the furthest corners, which the film certainly does. Now, what is that trying to say? Is it just empirical? Are you just looking at what music can do to help people to express themselves, or observing what they do when they get there?
I think it's a few things. I think it's partly about John's inability to reach the furthest corners.
This is the character who comes in and...
Yeah, the character that's sort of based on me.
Based on you as the keyboard player.
Yeah, who's basically more mediocre than everybody else in the band. And he just can't make it to the furthest corners. So all he can do in the end is try and get them to pull their furthest corners in a bit to kind of reach his. But yeah, I think really what's sort of driving what I do more and more as I get older is a kind of uncritical celebration of the marginal world. Also, we wanted to look at the relationship between mental illness and creativity, but only really to dispel the myth. John in the film has this idea that if only he was a bit more mentally ill, he could be great. And I think the film kind of dispels that whole myth of the kind of beauty of the tortured artist.
The suffering is real.
Yeah, the suffering is real.
Today, I'm going to do something that's actually completely different. Different as long as it's not the same as anything else that's been done, because otherwise it's time for something completely the same as something else. Thank you.
The original Frank clearly had an ambivalent relationship with fame too, because on the one hand he was surrounded by people, Chris Evans, Caroline Aherne went on to be Mrs. Merton, yourself and your success, people who went on and did really exciting things, but there was an element of self-sabotage there, or was it that he just didn't want to be famous?
No, I think there was self-sabotage going on. He was chaotic, so he never followed anything through. I know I read an interview with his guitarist who said it was maddening, because he'd have the most brilliant idea and he'd pull everybody in and everybody would sort of work towards this great idea, and then he'd just sort of at the last minute swerve off into something different. It certainly wasn't laziness. He was incredibly, he would be up all night building Frank things, in his garage. But it was chaotic. So yeah, all these other people around us, like Caroline Aherne, Mrs. Merton was an invention of Frank's, of Chris's, and then she decided to keep it going. And because she was focused, whereas Frank was chaotic, we'd watch Mrs. Merton rise and rise and rise, and we were still in the transit van going from Bury to Sheffield to Liverpool and back again.
But what was it about Frank Sidebottom that seemed to touch such a chord with British audiences? Was it kitsch? Was it a sense of musical calamity? What was it?
I don't think it was kitsch. I think it certainly attracted people in the north of England because it sort of pricked pomposity. A lot of the cover versions that he'd do were quite...
Born in Timperley.
Yeah, which was born in the USA. Yes. Anarchy in Timperley, which is Anarchy in the UK. It was all quite sort of pompous anthems that he would then sort of prick in this sort of silly way, which I think plays into a kind of northern sense of humour.
And a very ironic sense of humour as well.
Yeah, and also a sort of real oddness.
I go shopping in Timperley, 'cause we've got loads of shops. That's where I do all the shopping for me mum. 5 pounds of potatoes and loads of chops. So I was born in Timperley.
If the young Jon Ronson, Ents officer at college, had been told that he would find himself in 2014 having made a film set, largely in Ireland and America, about a slightly different Frank, played by one of the A-list movie stars of the time, surrounded by other famous movie stars, what would you have made of this extraordinary kind of part of the journey?
Well, my expectations for life back then were exceedingly low, and frankly, going to Bradford with the Frank Sidebottom Band and playing in front of 300 people was more kudos than I ever imagined possible. So this would certainly have been kind of outer space level kudos. But
you were very happy then?
Oh, I was incredibly happy. I mean, for me, there was nothing better than... kind of still feel the same way that actually... if I had the chance. Well, when Chris got back in touch with me in 2006, I was really hoping he'd asked me to rejoin the band. I would have...
The Blues Brothers moment when the
Yeah,
band gets back
exactly.
together again.
But he never asked me to do it. He just wanted me to write something in The Guardian instead.
I was born in Italy. You know I was.
Jon Ronson. Frank is released in cinemas nationwide on Friday, May the 9th, certificate 15.